today we are talking to another German composer pioneer in computer music, Rudolf Stember. Hello,
Hello.
Rudolf. Thanks for taking
Hello.
the time today to talk to me.
Yeah, finally, right?
Yes, well,
Took a while.
well, good come to those who wait, right?
Okay.
So let's start as usual. How did you actually get involved in touch with computers in the first place? How did it start for you?
Back then, a friend of mine, a neighbor, uh, the guy I was playing soccer together all the time, he got a C64, and so we hang out at his place and playing games and stuff. And I thought I need to have one of these as well. And yeah, actually back then I was saving up for VC20, and he said, "No, you don't want that. You don't want that. Save a little longer." And yeah, so my grandma back then gave me the rest of the money so I could get a C64, and that's how everything started.
That's very similar to the way how your co-worker Chris Huelsbeck got his computer. He also said
I know.
Get his this rest money from his grandmother. So
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Nice. And how did it start? Did you start with games playing like usual?
Oh yeah, I had a C64 with only a cassette tape, and I didn't have a floppy for a long time. And yeah, I started playing with games, and at some point I started my first little steps in BASIC, you know. But before I started doing some stuff in BASIC on the C64, I had a friend who already had a ZX81, and so I borrowed that for a while, and I started programming something on that. We had computers in school as well, like the Apple II, right? Everybody had those. And so I started with programming there a little bit, but especially on the ZX81, you quickly came to the end of the 1K memory, so there was nothing possible to do there. So
I've read that the first time you came into picture was actually at the demo scene at 88 under the Holy Grail name.
The Holy Grail.
Yes. For the demo group Argon.
Exactly. Yes. That was a bunch of friends of mine. We were together, including my little brother, who is an awesome programmer, by the way. And yeah, we were in that group. I don't remember how many people we were. More than 5. And yeah, that's how I started, programming in assembler on the C64. And that was also the time when I started making music on the C64, because nobody else in the group had any clue how to make music on the C64. So I ended up doing music for our demos for every part of everybody else in the group. So yeah.
And I've read you used Future Composer for that.
Oh, holy crap! I don't remember what I think so. There was also, was that the one from Södersoft? I don't know. I used that a lot as well. And I started making music on the C64 using TFMX, right? And but that was not usable for anything. It was good for making music, but you could not use it for anything besides that. There was no CPU time left to do anything else. But yeah.
Okay. And now the history books write that you started with Factor 5, but I know personally, because I have some games, you actually also did some music before for Rainbow Arts.
I even did games before that. And the thing is, the demo group I was with, we were just talking about, at some point, we were making demos all the time. And then Walter Konrad from Double Density back then came to us and asked, so you're making these demos, why don't you make any games? It's like, why? I said, yeah, we can make a game and sell it and make some money. And I thought, okay, I'll try that. So I programmed my first game. It was some type of space taxi clone on the C64. And so I programmed it. I made all the artwork. I made all the music and all the sound effects, and I sold it to Double Density. And that was it. I was paid. I got money for that work. And I told all the guys in my group, and they were like, what, you can make money with this?
Really?
so they started making tiny games for Double Density as well. And I ended up doing all the sound for all of these games back then. And that's how I actually got, started into making money with making music for games. And then at some point, two of our people working on a bigger project, and that was actually we showed that on the Amiga convention back then in, I don't know, it was a long time ago. And Boris Schneider actually was producer at Rainbow Arts back then, and he was pretty interested in that. That was the curse of Ra. And so he wanted to sign that for Rainbow Arts, and that's how I had my first major title with my music. They wanted to have Chris make the music for that, because Chris was at the time in-house musician at Rainbow Arts. But the two guys I was working with, they decided, no, we want him to do that. He has been doing everything for us so far. And so I ended up having my first major title with music right there. And
interesting.
Yeah, that's how that started.
I've read that those Double Density games were actually published by the CP Computec publishing house. Yes. For Game On and Magic Disc. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. That was what was happened back then, right? It was Magic Disc, and then also for Amiga later on. Then came Amiga on top of that, and some of us went on to, make games on the Amiga, and I ended up once again making sound for all of the titles back then. Yeah. And then when I came in touch with Chris at Rainbow Arts, we became great friends, because we were kind of like the unicorns in the game industry. We were the only musicians around in Germany, except for a handful others, like Jochen Hippel was there as well, and the Example people, I think. And so we became best friends. We put our instruments together from our studios, and we had jam sessions in Düsseldorf after hours when the company was closing. So, and yeah, it was fun times back then. Yeah.
Actually, I've read that you worked together with Chris Huelsbeck on the second Monkey Island game for the Amiga, the conversion. You did the music together with Chris Huelsbeck.
For the original Monkey Island, yes. Funny enough, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday around that. So the music was composed for the game at Lucasfilm Games back then. Mm-hmm. It was not LucasArts, it was Lucasfilm Games. So Michael Land was the composer for that, and Softgold Rainbow Arts was the publisher for Germany. Also, Boris Schneider once again did an awesome job translating everything to German.
Who is now actually called Boris Schneider-Jone.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And so he did the translation, and Chris was asked to do the music conversion for that. So and he was struggling, since it was reggae music. It was made for what was it back then, Sound Blaster or the Roland sound card. I think the original thing was for the Roland sound card was MIDI music. It was unquantized, and Michael was using a bunch of chords, a whole lot of chords and chords changing and stuff like that, and the melody was changing all the time, and had a hard time, making that happen on a 4-voice Amiga. And so at one point then they asked me to help Chris out with that, and Chris and I we talked about how we best approach that, and I ended up doing all of the instrumentation of that. That included like sampling all of the chords to make it one voice, have chords for one voice, and making sure we can use all the instruments to do the usual trick that we did all the time, like having the drums and the bass line on one voice, having the chords on another voice, and then do the melody sound on the third voice, splitting over to the fourth voice, which then eventually also needs to be dropped for sound effects and stuff like that. So that's usually composed in 3 voices, and that's how that came to happen. Yeah.
Interestingly, at those times, most people even didn't have a sound card, because an AdLib sound card for the PC was costing around 1,000 German marks.
Yeah.
And the Roland was even more expensive, a couple of thousands. And
Yes.
actually, most people back in the day, they heard Monkey Island with a PC speaker.
Yes, the beeping. Yes, I remember that thing fondly. Yeah, I don't even know what we were listening to, but I don't know. Maybe we had the Roland card too. But in the end, it was all MIDI files, so we can listen it to on a synthesizer with a general MIDI set, and trying to make that cram into an Amiga. I just listened to the Amiga title music yesterday. It's all right. I mean, we had pains with doing Monkey Island, and we both, Chris and I, were about to throw in the towel. Funny side story. And so we were kind of locked up at Rainbow Arts back then. I was in one room having my studio. He was in another room having his studio. And at some point we just thought, no, we're not going to do this. We don't. We just give up. And if we ever going to finish that, we're going to find Michael Land and we kill him.
I hope he's still alive.
And at that point, the producer back then was Kristen Dodd from Rainbow Arts. She said, all right, if you go through this, I owe you a pizza. So we said, all right, with pizza in mind, we finished doing the conversion, and she still owes us that pizza to this day. Yes, we brought it up the other day when we met her, and she was like, what? Pizza for what? And then we explained the story, and she was, okay. Well, next time we see each other. She lives in California right now. So might be a while. But yeah, at one point then, when Chris and I were working at Factor 5, and we started doing the Rogue Squadron games on N64 and all of that, we had a meeting with LucasArts when the LucasArts sound department came over to our Factor 5 office, and we wanted to talk about creative design, how we are going to approach creative design for these Star Wars games. And Michael Land was there as well. And Chris and I was like, we never thought we were going to meet this guy. Now he is here, so we have to tell him the story. And so we told him the story, but he didn't get it. That was kind of weird. It was like he didn't see the humor in it back then. But yeah, I don't know. But at least we got it out. We got it out of the way. We told him how we felt about his music, and that was it.
I mean, if he wasn't such a skilled composer, the music wouldn't be such a classic nowadays.
Yes, it is, and it's rightfully so. I mean, in retrospect, it's still a pain for me to listen to it, but it's well done. It's great track for the game, and a lot of people love it, and I don't. But that has reasons, right?
So if you would have to do the music nowadays with the knowledge you have now, you would do it different?
You mean the
Yeah.
composing style? The composing style?
I mean, you say people think it's great. It's a great conversion you and Chris did, but you said you personally don't like it. So if you were traveling back in time
No,
with the knowledge you have nowadays about composing, would you have done things differently?
I think I would have approached the music for the game a little different. I would have probably composed something else. But for what it is, what he did there, and how we tackled the conversion for the Amiga, I still think, yeah, it turned out pretty well for what it is. I mean, if Chris or I, when we were composing for the Amiga, we always had the Amiga in mind. You know, we always compose a little bit in the direction of what we can do and what does well on the Amiga. You know, and then with that, you already have certain limitations on what you want to do and what you can do, and you know what you need to avoid. You know, and Michael didn't do that. Of course not. Why would he, right? So we had to tackle all of the problems that that the composition of his music had for us to convert it onto the Amiga. And for that, what it ended up being, I think it was good. Yeah, it worked.
Interesting.
And maybe that's also that people, I don't know, I'm just speculating, but maybe that's also why people like the Amiga conversion so much, because it was composed without all these restrictions in mind. It was just like, you know, it was different for what everybody else was doing on the Amiga. That's for sure.
I mean, if you look at earlier times in the early 80s, it was even harder. I remember having an interview with Rob Hubbard, and he said that he spent hours going through the system memory of the Nintendo NES, looking for ways to make digital samples play better, and hoping there were illegal opcodes. But you were actually composing a bit later at that period, and you already had some technical knowledge about the Amiga and the machine you could access to, right?
Everything I did on the Amiga, I think everything that was commercially done was done in TFMX. I mean, Chris was using TFMX. He introduced me to TFMX when we became friends at Rainbow Arts, and I helped develop TFMX back then. And we both were using, of course, TFMX Pro, which I probably never saw the light of day outside of our, you know, two people. And nobody else was using it besides me and Chris, because it was not really user-friendly. It was like, okay, you need to be, you couldn't give it, you had no manual. I mean, TFMX was out, and there was a manual, but with the Pro version, with the 7-voice sample routine that was in there, that came later, that was also like really, that was actually, that's also an interesting story how that came along, but unless you want to hear it.
Sure. I'm here for stories.
So so we always were composing with TFMX. And Chris, of course, was doing music for Turrican. I guess that's breaking news right now, right? So he was doing Turrican at the time for the Amiga. And Thomas Engel, one of our programmers at Factor 5, he was doing the Atari ST conversion of Turrican back then, and he also made a TFMX sound routine for the Atari ST, where he was using the 4 voices of the Amiga TFMX routine, and you were sampling them together to be played back on the Atari ST on one sample voice. And that thing, 6800 code, right, on the Atari ST, that code, what he wrote for the Atari ST, we then used on the Amiga to mix 4 TFMX voices into one. So we had 4 voices mixed into one, and we have 3 of the original Amiga voices left. That's how we ended up with the 7 voice routine for the Amiga.
Wow.
Yeah.
So clever programming in the end.
Yeah. But there was not much calculation time left to do anything else. So we only used 7 voices for title musics or for credit scrolls or whatever, because you couldn't really use it in game.
Well, back in the days, a lot of people just loaded games to listen to the title music.
Okay.
That is what some people did back in the day, before there was sync player and all that stuff.
Maybe that's why a lot of people think that Chris did the soundtrack for Set Out, right? Because he only did the title music. I did the whole game.
I've also read another statement, and that is that for the Commodore 64 game music, you actually use Soundmaster 3.1, and it was later modified to allow fading and relocation. And it stated possibly it was modified by you.
I don't think so. No, I was able to program on the C64 in assembler, yes, but I never did a sound routine. No.
Okay, so
maybe it was done by my brother, but I don't really remember. I need to ask him. He is the guy who programmed everything. But I don't know if he ever touched that thing. I don't remember. It's a long time ago.
Okay, but it was definitely not you.
No.
It's interesting how some people got their facts. You wonder, assumptions, For me personally, the first time I got in touch with your name was the game Logical.
Mm-hmm.
I used to have the PC version first on a 386 computer in '93, and then later on I got an original copy of the C64 version, and I still think to this day the in-game music is absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah,
I really like that part.
It's one of my favorites as well, and Logical came out of the group of people that I was with before Factor 5 as well. It's the same programmers for the Amiga and the C64 version that I was working with from the demo scene, Mm-hmm. And for the Amiga version was actually the same people that were doing the Curse of Ra. So yeah, I had a lot of fun doing Logical because it wasn't the first, but it was a puzzle game, and you have a lot of freedom in composition for that. You just need to look out for that it's not getting boring for a long time. You can do what you want with melodies. You don't have to worry as much about sound effects, killing your fourth voice. You can use that. Not like with action shooters or whatever, when you have a lot of things going on the fourth voice. So yeah, Logical was a lot of fun. It's still one of my favorites too, yes.
Interestingly, I just saw yesterday that a lot of people, 5 years ago, were commenting on the music and the gameplay video of Logical, and they said there must be a new version of that for the PC. And I actually found that last year Thomas Scholl made a new version called Logical Now, and it's now available on Steam to actually purchase.
Oh, okay.
So there's a new version out since last year.
Does it still have my compositions?
I'm not sure. I only found his name mentioned in the credits. Okay. So
Yeah,
and he's also listed as the producer of the game, so I guess it's his game, but I don't know who did the music. But it's interesting that such a logical game became so famous, because usually you have things like Tetris and so on, and maybe Dr. Mario, and that's about it for those kind of puzzle games, actually.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, it was also at the beginning of the hype of all of these puzzle games, and everybody at that point, got into making puzzle games. Everybody had new ideas about puzzle games because they were easy to program, they were easy to make, but the market got saturated pretty quickly, and I don't know. People were then also quickly tired of puzzle games as quickly as they became, excited about them. It's kind of.
So now we spoke about how it all started and how you worked for Rainbow Arts, but I guess for Factor 5 you actually moved to abroad, right?
I was working, I was never an employee at Rainbow Arts. I was a freelancer.
Okay.
I was mainly working with the teams together. Sometimes I got hired by Rainbow Arts to make music for a title they were working on, Set Out, for example. They had that brought to them by Tobias Binzak, and Chris was already busy with everything else. They were working in-house, so they asked me if I could make the soundtrack for the Amiga version for Set Out, and had Chris only contribute the title music to that. So that was kind of like how most of the projects worked. Mainly I was working with my people, and at some point when Factor 5 became the company that it still is, they had me work on titles for Factor 5. But back in Germany, I was like working on BC Kid, but that was all also, I was an independent contractor, working for everybody else in the games industry in Germany. There was Ascon. I was working on Patricia and Anstoß and all of these games, and other companies. I mean, of course, the Schwarze Auge from Attic Software back then, and but only at the point when Factor 5 was asked to move to California to work on next gen console gaming back then. They asked me if I want to come along, and that's when I became employee to be able to move to the United States back then. Yeah.
So the moving actually marked the change of being freelancer.
Yes, exactly. But before that, I was also working on Game Boy titles for Factor 5. We did Probotector, we did Animaniacs, we did Super Nintendo version of Indiana Jones, and that all was done music by me in the Factor 5 office in Cologne for Factor 5 there, but I was not an employee at Factor 5.
I actually saw that, and I wonder why you never did the music for the Game Boy Color version of Logical.
I never heard about it. I don't know. Maybe did that came years later? I don't know. I mean,
it came a few years later. Yeah, I think it was 99 or something.
99?
Yeah.
1999?
Yes.
I was not in Germany then anymore. I was in the US.
Okay. But probably that is why.
I was an employee at Factor 5. Since May 96, I was employed at Factor 5.
So how was it for you to make the transition? I mean, now you are back in Cologne. So
now I'm back in Germany. Yeah, long story. But yeah, it was exciting back then. We were like 7 people in Cologne working on PlayStation title actually for LucasArts, and that involved burning a disk every day, sending it over with FedEx, and getting a bug report back via fax, the next day or 2 days later, whenever the disc arrived at LucasArts and they were testing it. And it was like a back and forth of, FedExing and faxing. And at some point they just said, how about you guys just move over here to make communication easier? We pay for everything, for the whole move, for the container, for visas, for green card, whatever. And then we decided, yeah, let's go. Let's do this. When do we ever have a chance to, get to the United States and work on the next big thing? And that's how it came along. We were there, and then then soon we started working on Star Wars Rogue Squadron for the N64, and yeah, that's how everything started. It was really exciting times over there. Yeah.
Did you have an idea back in the day that people would be interested in those old games again? That retro would be a hype, that people would ask about a new release of Logical, just as an example. Everybody knows about Chris, and he's being interviewed a lot, but there's not much about you actually.
No, there's not much about me, and I only, I think the last. Was it the last? Yeah, I think the last game I made music for was actually Ball Blazer Champions for the PlayStation back then. That was the game we were working on while we were moving to the United States, and that was for me the first game where everything in game was streamed via CD. That was really exciting, very fun to do, and that's. Was also kind of the last game I made music for. And after that, when Chris came and working on music for all the Star Wars stuff, I became the audio director of the company and making sound effects for the games, making the voice recordings, making sure the voice recording, sound effects, music, and cutscenes are all leveled correctly. I was basically mixing the games then, so Chris could concentrate on making the music for that. And I guess that's also kind of like part of that why Factor 5 as a company started of they care about audio, because yes, we cared about how to make them sound good, not just that the compositions were good, that the sound effects were good, but how to make everything else sound good that comes out of the console. And yeah, that's how we also ended up. We were making our own sound system back then, and Nintendo then was interested in having that, so we made it available for Nintendo developers to be able to use that. So we had to write a manual and had to do all of that, so we could actually pass that on to everybody else. And due to that sound system we were making, we ended up working on the next gen console, on the GameCube back then, because they wanted to have that on launch, that we can have, that they could provide developers with our sound system so they could make music for the titles they were working on. So we ended up having a development system, but to ended up making the first demo of the Rogue Squadron 2 for GameCube. But that's a story that Julian needs to tell. But yeah, that was mainly due to the fact that we had the sound system and that we could port it to the GameCube pretty easily. And that's how we always were on the front lines of the next gen game consoles. Yeah.
I also wondered, did you look besides you what other composers did? Did
Not
you have
much.
anybody you were looking up to?
You mean in the games industry?
Yes, in the game industry.
When? Back
Generally. I mean, you
Back
mentioned
when-
Michael Land for being horrible, to be so skilled, and converting the music was actually a horror trip. but I wonder, was there any influence you had where you said, okay, I've heard musics from this composer and that composer, and you borrowed something, an idea?
No, I don't think I borrowed any ideas, but there was a lot of there were a couple of composers that I really liked listening to, that I really enjoyed the music. I mean, back in the on the C64 days, of course, there was Rob Hubbard. I really enjoyed what he was doing, and Jeroen Tel from Maniacs of Noise. He had a style where I always felt like that I could immediately follow what he was doing next. And so it was kind of like it rang with me what he was doing. So I really liked Jeroen's music back then. Yes, of course. But in the game composers, no, I was looking further. I was looking for film composers. John Williams is a big idol for Chris and me for a long time, and because he always had that ability to shape a melody to fit on something, be it a character, be it a location, be it something like that, and then he shapes that melody once again if it's used in a different setting, to make it fit in there. So that's the great skill he has, where everybody where a lot of composers nowadays just compose for a scene. He always had a melody that he could transform into the scene, but where you would know what is going to happen with what character, just listening to the music. That was a great skill he had, and yeah, that's what I loved about his stuff.
I guess that made it even harder to convert it to game consoles and computers back then.
That is something that is something you have to ask Chris. I remember when he was sitting there and had to compose Star Wars music. That was not Star Wars music, but his own composition fitting into the Star Wars universe. That was the first time I saw Chris, and he thought, "I'm not worthy. I'm not able to do this. I'm not good enough for this kind of work." But he was.
The second time after Michael Land, actually.
Yeah, I mean, we met Michael once. There was this meeting with the direction, when we were told that everything we produce, that everything Chris made has to go to the ranch and has to be approved by Lucas Licensing, that it actually fits into the Star Wars universe, and and that was that. Everything did fit in the universe, so there was no big deal about that. I had more problems getting sound effects out of Skywalker sound for the Star Wars games. It was like, okay, now we're doing Star Wars title on the N64. Can I get some TIE fighters, lasers and stuff? And they were like, yes, you have to request them at Skywalker sound. So, okay, how do I request them?
Wow.
But that's a different story. That's also interesting. But yeah, that had nothing to do with music. But yeah, with bureaucracy back then. Yeah.
So a lot of game music actually is combined with the story, the way of getting there, because it wasn't easy. As I said, you needed approval. You needed to get the special sound effects or devices for the like a lightsaber and so on. So
for the sound effects, if we wanted to have sound, Star Wars, if we want to have a sound effect for the game, we had to request it with Skywalker sound at the ranch back then. We couldn't sample it out of the movie because there was always John Williams music playing. How do you do that? Right?
Okay, that was the main issue. I see.
So what happened then was like they said you need to request the sound effect. You need to provide us with a time code from the movie where the sound effect is that you want, and then we can send it back to you. It's like, what time code? So I ended up that they sent me, and that was the cool part. They sent me SVHS tapes back then of the original Star Wars trilogy of the first 3 movies with a time code in the picture.
Wow.
And where they had the movie had no music, had the sound effect track on the left side and the dialogue track on the right side of the. So left side sound effects, right side dialogue, and the time code. When they said, okay, you can use that, then if you hear the sound effect, write down the time code, send us the request, and then we send you the sound effect. It's like, for every single sound effect I want, they want me to write down the time code and say, no, thank you for the tapes. I now have all the sound effects isolated on the left channel. I sample them from there and make my own library. And that's what I did. I mean, there were SVHS tapes. The quality was good enough. The first thing I did was we were sampling all of the tracks, having audio tracks on the PC, and then I was cutting out sound effects and sorting them into what they were, giving them proper file names. And I ended up with a huge library of Star Wars sound effects. When I was combining, the things they had there as well, if they were not isolated enough. So I thought, okay, this was there, sounded like this, in combination with this. So I had my huge library of Star Wars sound effects. In fact, it was actually to the point that at some point, LucasArts came to me and was like, you have all these great sound effects for the games you guys were doing for us. How did you get those? There are sound effects in there that we don't even have. It's like, yeah, if you start requesting them at the Skywalker sound, you can wait a long time for them. I made them myself, using what I had here, and they were asking me if I could provide LucasArts with my Star Wars sound effect library that I created. And
you did work for them.
Yes.
Interesting story.
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, why not? I mean, I guess back then you had things like, the postal service, faxes. Things were taking long, so I guess you would take shortcuts a couple of times to save time.
Well, the ranch was just around the corner. That was when we were working in California.
Okay.
We were at Lucas Valley Road. Our office was at Lucas Valley Road. We were in walking distance to LucasArts. They were at Los Gamos, which is a cross street right there.
Okay.
And if you go out on Lucas Valley Road, then you come to Skywalker Ranch. It's like a 15-minute drive, I think, 20-minute drive. I was at the ranch a bunch of times, visiting. I still have friends that work at Skywalker Sound there. So nowadays it would be less of a problem to get something, but back then it's like, you have to make a request and then legal has to approve it, and yeah. It got even worse when we were working on the hidden Easter egg. You remember Rogue Squadron? We had a Naboo starfighter in there.
I don't know about Easter eggs.
No.
No.
So we had the Naboo starfighter in Rogue Squadron, and the Naboo starfighter was in the game before the movie was released. Before the movie came out, Episode 1. So working on stuff like that, you had to sign your firstborn to Skywalker Sound.
Interesting. So I wonder, nowadays I guess it's a lot different to make game music. I mean, if you look at the platforms, you have PlayStation, you have Xbox and PC, and those game consoles are basically PCs, right? So,
with a good graphics.
Pardon?
With the good graphics cards, yes.
Yeah. So, do you sometimes miss the old way of making game music?
As I said, I haven't been making game music since the PlayStation 1, and I enjoyed a lot making music for systems that were allegedly not capable of doing what we did back then. It's like, squeezing the last bit of sound quality out of an Amiga or out of a Game Boy or stuff like that. That was fun to do back then. And yes, if I ever want to do it again, I would rather do it on that than go into a studio and produce music for a game these days. That's what's happening now. I mean, with Lair, we did Lair for PlayStation 3 as a launch title, and even there, Chris was not composing anymore for our in-house games. They had a Hollywood composer making the music for Lair, John Debney, and Chris ended up being the guy who cut everything that John was doing into pieces that could be used in a game, because he had no idea about how to make music interactive. That if you're flying around on your dragon and all of a sudden you're getting attacked, you need to change the speed, the tempo, the whole flair of the music. So Chris, of course, knew about that, and so he was using the compositions Debney did to make it palatable for a game. And I'd rather have it composed directly on the console and you be able to react to that while you're doing that, rather than having switch tracks like this and do all this stuff. I don't know. I'm in that respect, I'm certainly a retro guy that likes the way things were back then.
But nowadays you are more a producer.
These days I'm a associate producer at Epic Games, working on Fortnite. I have not much to do with audio anymore. That's what I'm doing now. Yeah, it's much more, it's, I don't know how to put it. The thing is, back then, like 30 years ago, when I was making music for games, being creative under pressure, it's really hard. You have a deadline, you need to compose something for this something, and if you don't have an idea, it's getting tough squeezing that out of your brain, and then you start working the whole night. I mean, Chris knows also very well how that is, how he ended up not sleeping for days, just because ending up, you have to have this composition ready for that at that time. And today, I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. Being creative, with under pressure. The job I'm doing now as producer there at Epic Games is, I wouldn't say more stressless, because certainly we have our crunch times as well. Fortnite has a new version every 2 weeks or something where we have to, work on, or not. But, most of the time we have some feature in there that our team did that ends up in there. But it's a different thing. It's kind of like, okay, you have to concentrate on what is there and what you are doing and what you are working on. But it's not like you have to be creative, with a gun to your chest. It's like, okay, you come up with this music now. It's like, no, it's not that anymore. So, and I can deal with that in my age, with my age by now, much better than, being under pressure, being creative.
I see. But you told me last year at Gamescom there's one sound effect in Fortnite from you.
Yeah, there is one sound effect of me that I did in Fortnite. Yeah, it was kind of funny. Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to explain the circumstances, but in the end, it was like, we need to have this now to be going live now. And I said, okay, I do it. I make a sound effect. I make the sound effect and I provide it. I make it happen, and then show it, send it out to the guys, and they say, yeah, that sounds good. We can use that. Who has the license of that? How do we? I said, no. We don't need to license. I did it. I made it. I'm a sound designer. I'm coming from the sound design sides. I'm working at Epic. We can use it. I made it. over, discussion over. So okay,
Really?
fine. Then it ended up in for that event there, yeah. But it's like the sound department was under pressure doing different things. Nobody had time, and I said, screw it, I make it.
Okay.
So
Interesting story.
There was one sound effect in Fortnite. Yes.
Interesting.
It's probably that sound effect probably was heard by a lot more people than all of my game music ever together.
How long did you take for the sound effect?
It was just one sound effect, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Okay.
How long I was actually recording it with microphone and stuff, doing it. Yes.
Okay. So I wonder, back in the day, how did you start making a piece of music? I mean, I know that a lot of composers actually use synthesizers and then scaled it down to what the system's sound chip would be able to do.
Right.
How did you do it?
Pretty much the same way. I mean, I had, but the first money I made from that first game I sold, remember that Space Taxi? That money that money I invested into buying a Yamaha TX16W. That was a Yamaha sampler, the 12-bit sampler back then, and I already had a synthesizer, an YS100 from Yamaha, pretty cheap FM synthesizer back then. So I had these two, the YS100 and the TX16W. And I was composing. Usually I start with the piano, trying, to find a theme, trying to find a, harmonic and with a theme. And then I would, think about what I want to do sound-wise, how the flavor should be. You can take any piece of melody and make it like lighthearted or make it, heavy metal or whatever. And but that was kind of like the first step. On the Amiga then, I actually ended up, using the TX16W sampler, which were 12-bit, but I wrote myself a software on the Amiga that could read those discs, read those samples, convert them to 8-bit. So I had a really good sampler for the Amiga. I didn't have to sample directly with the Amiga, which I did a lot of times as well. But, being able to use the studio sampler and just loading these samples into the Amiga and converting them, that was then a lot of times that I did that. Yeah. But yeah, you play the sound on the keyboard, especially if on the Amiga for chords. On the C64, you were using arpeggios all the time. That's how you do chords on the C64. But on the Amiga, to play a chord, you either use 3 voices for your chord, or you sample the chord and play it on 1 voice. So yes, and that's how we ended up, sampling the synthesizers also to use the flavor for what the Amiga music should be ending up sounding like.
I've heard a lot of composers actually telling me that they are so sad that the Paula sound chip from the Amiga doesn't have filters. What is your perspective on this?
If it has, I never used them.
It doesn't. So I heard from a lot of composers they would would have loved to make sounding like the C64 on the Amiga.
That's true. I mean, we were basically using the Amiga as a 4-voice sampler back then, and it was all about, timing samples correctly to make it sound, make it sound well. I mean, with TFMX, you had some sort of functionality that you could do to to make it different. One function that we used a lot on the TFMX was like you had macro language that for every note you play, a macro gets started. It's a macro language that can say, okay, start sample, wait until the end of the sample and then stop and give the voice back. That's the basic macro that we were using. But you had other different. Was that on TFMX already, or was that on our sound system for the N64? Never mind. We could also, start the sample later, especially for bass sounds or for bass drums or for whatever that has a sharp attack. If you use that sample, but you jump into the sample a little later, the sounds get softer. It's like if you had a filter on it. It has not the sharp attack anymore, but it sounds different. And then we were using that later. I don't know for the Amiga if we did that, but certainly for the N64, it's like making that velocity dependent. It's like the harder you hit your key, on the keyboard, the less you would jump into the sample. If you play it really softly, you jump further into the sample that you can have, some sort of velocity dependent sound changes. And that's how you do things with a sampler as well, And I was not missing any filters. I was never a guy like Chris that loved to fiddle around with a sound until it fits. I'm not good at doing puzzles as well. It's like I want to get finished. I want to make, I want to do the composition. I don't want to make the sound. I want to compose something. I don't know, and that's what it was for me. Like it's like, okay, I'm making my samples and I'm using them, and if they fit together, I'm using them again.
So it's like, get done with it already. It's good enough. Let's move on.
No. I wanted to have good sounds for my music, and I made, I think, good samples for the music I did for the Amiga. But I never were, somebody who was spending, hours like Chris on trying out the filters and how you make it sound exactly as you wanted. No, I wanted to go on with composing the music.
I mean, there are other composers who did a similar approach. For example, Dave Lowe, who is known to have converted many arcade games to the C64 and Amiga, and he did things like the music for Street Fighter 2 or Power Drift, and he always used the same drums, so you could always hear, okay, those are Dave Lowe's drums on the C64, because he would always use the same kind of drums. So kind of recycling.
On the C64, I was doing the same stuff. Yeah, it's like you make your you have your set of sounds that you work together well, and if you have that already, as I said in the beginning, I also compose music with that in mind. It's like I have these sounds work together well. What can I compose with to make that work for this game or for this scene? And that's what I did. It's more like getting the job done.
You mentioned at the beginning what you liked about games like Logical, that you would have a freedom of how many voices you can use, and you didn't have to get rid of one voice because of the sound effects that would be played during the game. And there are different approaches in those old retro games. For example, Jeroen Tel, which you also mentioned, always used one channel for the sound effects, and then the two other channels on the Commodore 64 for music. So he was more like multiplexing the instruments so it would sound richer. Like other composers, for example, Dave Lowe, would switch off the lead voice when a sound effect was played and then switch it on again and try to make it in such a way that the player would notice that the lead voice is switched off for a fraction of a second. So you weren't a fan of the second approach of switching off something to make something else available at that time?
I think it was for me it was always more a hybrid of the two. If there's I always would keep one voice that I think I have to get along with that one if it's dropped off. You know, it's kind of like the Urintel approach that I would not keep it empty, you know, but you know, keep it clean and only use 2 voices for that. But I would, you know, compose in a way that it's not really a problem if it drops off. On the C64, it's kind of, I don't remember much how we did that back then, but on the Amiga for certain, I know that we kept the 4th voice always as a reserve for sound effects. And what we would do then was either use it as a reverb channel for the lead voice. You know, that you play the lead voice on the 3rd voice, and then you start the same note on the 4th voice, you know, with a lower volume, you know, then you have to have a delay, so it sounds richer. If you just listen to Chris's, for example, Turrican stuff or what, then you have that open world, this open reverb thing going on. As soon as the sound effects start, if you start shooting, the reverb is gone because you have the sound effects. So that's where I was doing the same thing, you know, for stuff that I was doing, you know, especially for Z out, and you know, for Logical not so much because there was not much on sound effects going on. And but yeah, I would always keep in mind that the 4th voice can be dropped, but I would not, you know, sacrifice the melody for that. Maybe sometimes, depends on really, you know, on what the approach was or what the game was. Sometimes it doesn't matter if the melody drops. You know, if you have a lot of shooting going on, you probably don't listen to the melody anymore anyhow, and then it's okay. But if you have something like Logical, you know, and you doing, you know, you rotate the wheels and have sound effects for that, you do not want to lose the lead voice while you're listening to the music.
Interesting. Thanks for the insight of this technical difference. You know, not a lot of composers like talking about that, what they had to sacrifice. You know. Now an interesting question. You mentioned LucasArts. Back in the day, it was called Lucasfilm Games first. And I once had an interview with Chris Huelsbeck, who was the sound manager of Epix and also did the sound effects for Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken. And now you mentioned that you first started composing in Germany and then moved to the US. So I wonder, how did you go with the PAL 50 Hertz and NTSC 60 Hertz difference? I remember that I asked Chris Huelsbeck the same question, why games like Zack McCracken, Maniac Mansion, or Summer Games sounded too slow in Germany. And he told me that back in the 80s, they didn't know about the sound difference of the PAL and NTSC thing. You know? So he didn't know that the music would play slower in Europe.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we were in the 90s, we were doing Amiga stuff. I don't even think that a lot of the stuff, I don't even know what it was like then for the Americans. We didn't care. But when I was moving to the US, I was working on Ballblazer Champions on the PlayStation. All the music I did there was, you know, composed in the studio and streamed from the CD. So PAL or NTSC didn't matter for me. I don't know.
For the early works, you left that fixing job to the coders of the games, actually.
I'm actually curious now what how games sound different in the US version and the European version. I don't really know. I never thought about that. I mean, of course, we have had problems with NTSC and PAL, of course. I mean, especially you know, but on the video side of things. I mean, I was doing the video editing for Factor 5 as well, and that was always an issue. Yeah, but never thought about that. The games were running at different speeds.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, actually, it's a difference of around 20%. And you can really notice it in the music if the music was supposed
No,
to.
I can imagine that if I slow down any of my tracks by 20%, I notice that. Yes, of course, that's a lot.
So you weren't aware pretty much.
No. I mean, of course, we all knew that, we had our 50 hertz in Germany, and we had 60 hertz in the States, and but I didn't think about it much in terms of music. No.
Interesting. So actually the same answer like Chris Crick. It's interesting because from the nowadays perspective, you have the internet, you know everything, and sometimes I wonder why didn't people care about this difference back in the 80s or early 90s? But as I said, you didn't even think about it, so it wasn't really a big thing. I guess the most important was that the game doesn't crash.
Yeah, well, I think they all do at some point. I mean, you can never get something done, or there was a rule in the games industry, and I still think it's the same thing. You never get finished. At some point you just have to abandon it. And it was the same with compositions for me. If I compose something, I can spend until infinity on making it better, to tweak it to death, actually, and that was, at some point you have to say goodbye to it. You have to abandon it and say that's it, and not touch it anymore. But then years later you think about it, it's like, yeah, I could have done something else, and I could have changed this, and it never leaves you like that, but that's how it is.
Is there a game that you would like to redo the music for?
Yes.
Do you want to share which game it is?
I certainly would like to. I mean, Indiana Jones for the Super Nintendo back then, that was a pain in the ass, and I'm not happy with how it turned out. It was, trying to squeeze John Williams into the Super Nintendo back then was not a fun job to do. And, especially since I have no clue on reading score, right? I play by ear. I always did. If I hear something, I can, I listen to it and I can play it. But I don't do notes. I don't do score. And on that game, actually, that was in 93, 94, we visited Lucasfilm Games, and we had a tour of the studio back then, right across from ILM. It was on the same street. They were both at the same address. And I came there, and the producer that we were working with, Kalani Streicher, he told me, I have a present for you, for Indiana Jones. And he gave me a box, like a huge box. There were legal paper in there. As legal is the size format. They have, you have letter and they have legal. In Germany we have A4, so it's kind of like 2 A4 pages. And it was like this thick, a pile of handwritten scores from John Williams for all of the Indiana Jones movies, printed out, duplicated, copied, and every single page had a stamp on it, property of Lucasfilm. So I had this huge box with handwritten scores, orchestral scores, John Williams.
Which you couldn't read.
Which I couldn't read to begin with anyhow, because it was handwritten. It looked like some insects were crawling over the paper.
Okay.
So I ended up with this, okay, thanks, I guess. So I was taking it home, and I was there, okay, trying to find something in there. It's kind of like, how do I even find the most famous indie theme? You know, how do I find it in there? I had no clue. It was not helpful to me at all. And I had a friend. She was playing piano, and you know, she was pretty good at playing piano. And I showed it to her, and she was like, "Okay, I don't know, but there's also different things." You know, with that project, I learned a lot about how an orchestra works, because they have self-transposing instruments in there. You know, that you have a flute that is in E, you know, or in F, and the notation for that, you know, is not the same. You know, because you know it's already playing in that note, so you score it differently. So I was wondering all the time why nothing I did, you know, for these for the instrumentation, why nothing was fitting the violins, for example. It's like how this sounds off. You know, I had no clue. I was so clueless. And she said that she has a friend who plays in an orchestra, and he will come along, and then we can talk about it. And so this guy came along, and that was then explaining to me, yeah, I know this because there's self-transposing instruments and this and this and that and that. So he had me a little bit finding, you know, the themes I wanted to use for Indiana Jones on the Super Nintendo back then, and that was then enough for me to, you know, do the rest by ear. But it was a painful job, and it didn't do the original music justice in any way for what it's worth. It's like I would like to have done that differently with the knowledge I have these days. You know, make it sound better. But yeah,
maybe another life.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's really pretty stories. How long did it take to encode the sheet music?
I don't. You mean to decode it?
To decode it.
Decode it and then encode it into an N60 Super Nintendo. I don't know. That's you know how the brain tends to forget, you know, bad memories. I guess that's.
How do you remember the good times? I see.
That's one of them. Yes.
Hopefully, this interview is one of the good times. Right. So you actually, what happened after Factor 5? What was your next step?
After Factor 5, after Factor 5 was in 2008 when the company closes, and I ended up doing freelance stuff again in California. I was working on graphic design stuff, and since I've been doing, you know, working in Photoshop also for a long time, since 1993, I've been, you know, working in Photoshop. I became pretty good in doing Photoshop stuff, and I also had a friend I had a bunch of friends in California, but I had a friend that was doing CD publishing, so I was working with him a little bit on music and music videos and, you know, cover artwork and stuff like that. And I had another friend who actually was a composer at LucasArts back then, David Levinson. He's also a great composer. And I was working with him a little bit, helping him out on titles like I was doing sound effects for Skylanders and Marvel Heroes. I was working with him on Marvel Heroes a little bit, and, you know, was doing that.
Do you have any plans, like where you want to be in 10 years, maybe? Is there the next big thing for you?
In 10 years, I'd like to get outside again at some point, you know, with the whole pandemic going on right now.
Of course, yeah. That's really not...
short-term goals, yeah.
But on the other hand, everybody is easy to catch on the phone right now because everybody is in home office. So it was True. First try and it got you on the phone. Was no problem.
Yeah, I mean, I hope in 10 years we will still be working with Epic. It's a great company to work for, and yeah, looking forward for the next time.
Great, yeah. Interesting. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time. That would be all my questions, and I hope I didn't miss anything important.
I don't think so. No.
Great. So,
all right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.